What happens when the silver spoons finally run out of the glamorous and turn into a toxin that hunts its own heritage? The short answer is, it's a complete disaster. Watch this video till the end to see how the biggest mark of shame on the royal family is still leeching off of the estate his ancestors left them. And what is the final thing Prince Andrew wouldn't let go? We won't tease you about it. It's the royal house of Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson. Prince Andrew was born to live in gilded cages, to exist in the shadow of expectations he could never fully escape. Second son of Queen Elizabeth II, he was not destined for the throne. He was never the golden child, never the heir, yet from the moment he could walk, he acted as if the world owed him compliance. Privilege had molded him into a boy with demands and a temper, a boy whose anger often spilled into cruelty. At the royal stables, young Andrew once picked up a sturdy stick and began striking the legs of the horses, watching them flinch under his blows. It was not a play, it was a glimpse of a child, learning he could dominate what was weaker than him, a foreshadowing of the arrogance that would define him. More humiliations awaited him, as palace life was rigid and unforgiving. In one documented incident, Andrew was reportedly beaten by palace guards, punished for his defiance or mistakes with a ferocity reserved for adults. In another story that circulated quietly within royal circles, he was thrown into a pile of shit after he annoyed one of the employees. When he ran to his mother, she understood that Andrew was in the wrong and rejected the resignation letter of the humble employee, ashamed of his actions. It was an event that could have shattered a lesser child. For Andrew, it hardened him, taught him to deflect shame with entitlement. These early events became the foundation of a man who would cling desperately to power and possessions later in life. Amid these brutal lessons, Andrew found a sliver of hope in the form of a house that promised escape. The Royal Lodge, perched on the edge of Windsor Great Park, was not yet his home, but it loomed in his imagination as a sanctuary. A relatively modest palace by royal standards, it offered 30 rooms, gardens, and a quiet distance from the omnipresent eyes of Buckingham Palace. Official archives note that Andrew visited the lodge as a child, sometimes on family retreats, absorbing its stately architecture and imagining a life that could belong entirely to him. Even then, the house symbolized a freedom he did not yet deserve, a private kingdom within a kingdom, a place where he could carve out identity apart from the crown. Andrew's youth was filled with contradictions. The boy who endured shame and physical punishment also harbored dreams of grandeur. He would picture himself walking the corridors of Royal Lodge not as a visitor, but as the master, imagining rooms furnished to taste, gardens sprawling under his control, halls echoing with laughter and power. The lodge became a mental refuge, a space where he could imagine himself unshackled from the hierarchy that threw him to second place. As he grew up, the Royal Lodge's pull grew stronger. It was more than bricks and mortar. It represented what Andrew thought life should be, a place to assert authority, to be admired, to never feel small again. The palace staff whispered that he would never inherit the crown, yet Andrew acted as if the lodge were his birthright. The longing for the home foreshadowed a man who would one day refuse to leave, a man for whom memories of fleeting happiness would outweigh the reputational cost of scandal. In 2003, the dream became reality. Andrew secured a 75-year lease on Royal Lodge, a sprawling estate that required extensive refurbishment. Official records indicate a £7.5 million renovation, including the installation of a swimming pool, conservatory, and full modernization of the 30-room mansion. This was not merely maintenance. This was Andrew asserting permanence, declaring that he would claim this space as his own, even if the world outside judged him harshly. Every marble surface, every gilded door, every landscaped path became a statement. This is mine. The lodge was a refuge, yes, but also a mirror of his upbringing, grand, rigid, and unforgiving. The boy who had been beaten by guards, thrown into filth, and forced to navigate the cold indifference of palace life, had now recreated that world in miniature, surrounding himself with perfection, while the cracks of scandal and public scrutiny quietly formed around him. The Royal Lodge would come to embody Andrew's contradictions, a sanctuary built on ambition, a palace forged from both hope and entitlement. Here, he could imagine himself untouched by the mistakes of the world, shielded by walls and gardens from the scrutiny he had long feared. Yet these very walls would later witness the unraveling of the man who clung too tightly to privilege, a man whose dreams of freedom and respect would collide with the reality of scandal and disgrace. For now, in this first chapter of his life, Royal Lodge was a place of potential, a boy's dreams, a prince's fantasies, a second son's refuge, a house that promised everything while quietly foreshadowing the fall to come. Stuff started changing when he got into the real world. He was an acclaimed soldier, but all of that went to hell when, in 2019, Andrew's association with Jeffrey Epstein resurfaced, casting a long shadow over his public life. The BBC's Newsnight interview, intended to quell the growing controversy, instead magnified it. Andrew's attempt to explain his relationship with Epstein was met with widespread skepticism. He claimed to have stayed with Epstein in 2010 to sever ties, but this explanation did little to assuage public concern. The interview's most infamous moment came when Andrew denied sweating during an alleged encounter with Virginia Giuffre, citing a medical condition caused by an adrenaline overdose during the Falklands War. Medical experts and the public alike found this explanation dubious, further tarnishing his credibility. The allegations against Andrew were not limited to public relations missteps. Virginia Giuffre accused him of sexual assault, claiming she was trafficked by Epstein and forced to have sex with Andrew when she was 17. The photograph of the two together, with Ghislaine Maxwell in the background, added a visual element to the accusations that Andrew could not easily dismiss. While he denied the allegations, the damage to his reputation was irreversible. In 2022, Andrew reached an out-of-court settlement with Giuffre, reportedly amounting to £12 million. As part of the settlement, Andrew acknowledged that Epstein had trafficked countless young girls over many years and expressed regret for his association with Epstein. He pledged to support the fight against sex trafficking and its victims, though the settlement did little to restore his standing within the royal family or the public eye. The fallout from the Epstein scandal was swift and severe. Queen Elizabeth II stripped Andrew of his military titles and royal patronages, effectively removing him from public life. He was also excluded from royal events, including the family's Christmas celebrations. The titles he had once held with pride were now revoked, and the Royal Lodge, once a symbol of his aspirations, became a reminder of his fall from grace. Despite the scandals, Andrew's association with Epstein continued to haunt him. In 2025, former Swiss beauty queen Beatrice Kuhl revealed that Epstein had attempted to lure her by offering a meeting with Andrew 6 years before the prince publicly stated he first met Epstein. This revelation cast further doubt on Andrew's previous statements and deepened the public's mistrust. The scandals surrounding Andrew were not confined to his personal life. His ex-wife, Sarah Ferguson, also faced scrutiny due to her connections with Epstein. In 2025, the City of York Council deliberated on whether to strip Ferguson of her honorary title, following the emergence of an email in which she referred to Epstein as her supreme friend. The council's decision to review her title mirrored the earlier revocation of Andrew's title, highlighting the ongoing consequences of their associations. Andrew's attempt to distance himself from the Epstein scandal by claiming a medical condition and denying the allegations only served to deepen the public's skepticism. The once celebrated prince, who had dreamed of ruling from the royal lodge, now found himself isolated and disgraced. The house that symbolized his aspirations stood as a silent witness to his fall from grace. By the mid-2020s, Prince Andrew had become a man stripped of influence, stripped of titles, and stripped of the respect he once took for granted. The scandals that had erupted around him, the Epstein connection, the Giuffre allegations, and the disastrous BBC interview had done more than damage his reputation. They had isolated him from the royal family, turning him into an outcast in the institution that had once defined his life. Every public appearance was met with scrutiny, every statement dissected, every smile judged as an attempt at damage control. Andrew had been reduced to a shadow of a prince, and he knew it. The royal lodge, the house that had once symbolized his dreams, became his fortress. Here, he clung to memories of better days, memories of Sarah Ferguson laughing in the gardens, of children's birthdays celebrated in opulent rooms, of private retreats where he could imagine himself untouchable. The renovations he had spent millions on, swimming pool, conservatory, private cinema, now served less as luxury and more as anchors to a past he could not reclaim. The grandeur of the estate, once a symbol of his rising status, had become a gilded cage. Andrew's social world contracted dramatically. Invitations to public events ceased. Military affiliations were revoked. Patronages vanished. The man who had attended ceremonies with the Queen, who had posed for photographs alongside world leaders, now found himself wandering the halls of Royal Lodge like a ghost. Isolation fed his desperation, and desperation fed his clinging to the one thing that still bore his mark: the house itself. It was more than residence. It was a claim to identity, a defiance of the consequences he faced elsewhere. The scandals continued to bleed into his life with relentless persistence. Epstein's associates, past acquaintances, and investigative journalists reminded the world of Andrew's connections, of parties attended, of flights taken, of encounters denied but documented. Even minor revelations, emails, sightings, and accounts from former staff sparked outrage and deepened Andrew's estrangement. He had become a man whose life was measured by the public's contempt, and every news cycle reinforced the narrative he could no longer escape. The settlement with Virginia Giuffre in 2022 offered no relief. The payout, reportedly £12 million, was a financial blow, but did little to restore credibility or relationships within the royal family. Public sentiment remained overwhelmingly hostile. The monarchy itself had begun to distance itself completely from Andrew. Invitations to family weddings, Christmas events, and official commemorations are gone. Andrew's place in the lineage of prominence had been effectively erased, leaving him dependent on the one domain he could still call his own. Even as Andrew tried to project normalcy within the walls of Royal Lodge, whispers followed him. Former acquaintances hinted at erratic behavior, attempts to maintain appearances that were increasingly fragile. desperate. Reports circulated of long, solitary walks through the gardens, hours spent in his private cinema, afternoons staring at rooms filled with furniture and art that symbolized a life slipping away. He moved from room to room, from pool to conservatory, each corner of the lodge a reminder that time had passed him by, that the world outside no longer welcomed him. His personal relationships suffered alongside his public reputation. Sarah Ferguson remained connected to him in a complex, strained manner, occasionally visiting or communicating. Yet even their bond was overshadowed by scandal and public judgment. The children, Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, had to navigate the consequences of their father's actions, and Andrew's attempts to assert normalcy often met with frustration and distance. The family that once formed the nucleus of his identity was now fractured, leaving him to retreat into the material world he had built around him. The Royal Lodge, in all its grandeur, became a stage for introspection and regret. Every ornate door, every gilded railing, every landscaped path reminded Andrew of what he had achieved materially but lost emotionally and socially. The house was his last bastion, and yet it could not fill the void left by public scorn and family estrangement. The pool shimmered under the sun, but its reflection offered no comfort. The conservatory bloomed with life, yet Andrew remained emotionally barren. The mansion, meant to be a symbol of triumph, had become a monument to isolation. Even minor scandals continued to pierce the walls of Royal Lodge. Allegations that surfaced from Epstein's network, connections hinted at by journalists, and renewed public outrage at his infamous interview ensured that Andrew's world remained under siege. Each story was a reminder that the outside world had not forgotten, that public anger persisted, and that no amount of opulence could shield him. The man who had once wielded power and privilege now navigated a life dictated by shame and caution. By the end of this period, Prince Andrew's life had contracted into a single axis: Royal Lodge. It was a house, a fortress, a prison, and a sanctuary all at once. Here he could cling to the remnants of a former identity. Here he could retreat from the relentless judgment of the outside world. Yet every corner of the lodge whispered the truth. Wealth and privilege cannot erase scandal, cannot mend relationships, and cannot restore a place in a family that has chosen distance over forgiveness. Now let's talk about the main thing. The House of Drums. Just what is it like? The Royal Lodge stands on the edge of Windsor Great Park, a sprawling estate that on the surface exudes serenity. But for Prince Andrew, it is more than land and architecture. It is a monument to memory, a shrine to privilege, and a fortress against the consequences of his actions. Every stone, every corridor, every room carries the weight of history and personal attachment. Originally constructed in the early 19th century, the lodge has been home to generations of royal family members, including Queen Elizabeth II's mother, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. For Andrew, childhood visits here planted the seeds of ownership in his imagination, a sense that grandeur could become his sanctuary. He walked its grounds as a boy, unaware that the house would later become a gilded cage. Historical records confirm that Andrew was familiar with the property from a young age, its formal gardens and imposing facade, a playground for a child accustomed to privilege. In 2003, Andrew secured a 75-year lease and undertook renovations costing £7.5 million, excluding VAT, and paying a £1 million premium. The work transformed the lodge into a modern palace while retaining its classic elegance. The main house now contains 30 rooms, including 7 bedrooms expansive reception areas, a formal dining room, and a conservatory that overlooks meticulously landscaped gardens. Every renovation, every choice in furnishing, broadcasts Andrew's assertion: "This is mine, mine to command, mine to preserve." The interior reflects both opulence and personal taste, though taste has been a subject of quiet critique. The walls are adorned with portraits of royal ancestors, oil paintings of stoic monarchs, and ceremonial memorabilia, a constant reminder of the bloodline he claims but whose privileges he has squandered. The carpets are thick, the chandeliers grand, the furniture upholstered in silks and velvets that scream wealth, excess, and the power once promised to a second son who had long imagined himself a king. Outside, the estate expands into formal gardens, a swimming pool, tennis courts, and a private walled courtyard. The pool glimmers in the sun, an emblem of luxury that contrasts sharply with the public's perception of Andrew as a disgraced prince. The gardens are manicured to perfection, every hedge trimmed with precision, every flower bed a calculated display of order and control. Yet for Andrew, these spaces are not just aesthetic. They are psychological barriers, protective boundaries against scrutiny, gossip, and judgment. Even the servant and staff quarters speak to the lodge's function as both home and fortress. A gardener's cottage, staff offices, and private maintenance areas allow Andrew to manage the property with minimal intrusion from outsiders. This control, meticulously maintained, is a microcosm of the man himself, desperate to dictate his environment even as the world outside spins with scandal and condemnation. Andrew's personal life, of course, is inseparable from the house. Reports indicate that the lodge witnessed moments of familial bonding. Birthdays of Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie celebrated in private rooms, summer afternoons spent in the conservatory, laughter echoing across halls that once symbolized ambition and hope. Yet it also bore witness to the growing isolation, the quiet despair of a man cut off from both family and society. Even the spaces intended for joy, the cinema, the swimming pool, the private dining areas, have been infiltrated by memories of public humiliation, relentless media scrutiny, and scandalous associations that no renovation could erase. The house's history is inseparable from Andrew's narrative of scandal. Every corridor has seen the private whispers about Epstein, every guest room a space once occupied by aides attempting damage control. Some rooms, untouched for years, stand as mausoleums of memory, furniture covered, books gathering dust, hallways echoing with the absence of a life once filled with expectation and now defined by disgrace. The architectural beauty of Royal Lodge cannot disguise the human failings embedded within its walls. But now, it's finally coming to an end. When King Charles offered Frogmore Cottage, it was not a simple suggestion. It was a statement, a royal directive that Andrew's era as a senior working royal had ended. The message was unmistakable. Royal Lodge, with its history, prestige, and personal memories, was no longer his to claim in the same way. Moving to Frogmore Cottage would be a symbolic demotion, a subtle stripping away of the privileges he had long taken for granted. For Andrew, leaving the Royal Lodge is not merely about relocating. It would be an admission that he is no longer central to the royal family, that his influence and relevance have waned. This is why his refusal is so multidimensional. It is pride, yes, but also him trying to stick to memory, status, and a sense of identity intertwined with the home. Royal Lodge is not just bricks and gardens. It is the epicenter of his personal history, the site of family milestones, shared joys, and a sanctuary from public opinion. To leave it now is to erase decades of connection, a surrender to a reality he is not ready to face. Sources close to the palace describe the tension as delicate but palpable, a mix of polite insistence from the king and quiet stubbornness from Andrew. Every meeting, every letter, every subtle nudge from Buckingham conveys the same expectation. The lodge is no longer negotiable, yet Andrew's attachment makes him cling, resisting the inevitable.